Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the keynote address of the International Conference on Transformative Education 2024. It is my honor to introduce our keynote speaker for the conference, a true champion of global education for social change, both locally and globally. Uh, with over 3 decades of experience, Liam Wegimont has worn nearly every hat in the world of education, from a youth worker to a teacher, from a school principal to an organizational head of a governmental network, and currently as the executive director of GEAN, which is Global Education Network Europe, which Liam co-founded, creating a vital network for education ministries and agencies across Europe to advance global education on a national and regional scale. So his dedication does not stop there. Liam has helped launch Angel, which is a renowned academic network on global education learning. It connects researchers and educators worldwide who are shaping the very future of global teaching and learning. And recently, he has spearheaded the European Congress on Global Education 2050, convening visionaries from across Europe and elsewhere to envision the future of education for the next generations of European citizens and global citizens. So these efforts are a testament to his ability to create inclusive participatory spaces where diverse voices shape the future of global education. From my personal experience, I can share he has ensured that the Dublin Declaration included experts and organizations, not just from Europe, but from beyond Europe, including countries from the global south. Notably, he ensured that the declaration welcomed experts and organizations to engage in difficult conversations that went more deeply into areas that are often difficult to discuss, like decolonizing education in Europe and beyond. So, beyond all of these achievements, Liam brings warmth and insight to everything that he does. He serves on editorial boards. He lectures across Europe at universities with a drive and passion to um, inspire transformative changes in education, and also to foster a more connected, thoughtful community of education leaders connected to shaping the future of humanity. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Liam. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, Liam. The floor is all yours. Um,
Ariane, thank you very much. I much appreciate both the invitation here and also your own commitment to global education, to learning, and to interregional dialogue for global education. And thank you for such a kind introduction. After such an introduction, it's hard to know where to start, but I thought perhaps I could start by trying to ensure some inclusion in this forum. So I would simply start. You've heard a bit about me and my own commitments. I'm surprised that I have any time for anything else, including family or farming, but try to. But I'd like to ask you to perhaps use the chat if you can, and if you'd like, to let us know where you're joining from and what sort of education you are involved in. Um, and I'm going to be focusing today, with thanks again to the Global Citizenship Foundation and to Ariane for the kind invitation. I'm going to focus on transforming education and hope to be able to suggest some hints and also some signs of hope for enhancing flourishing for people and planet through transforming education. And so just to say what I will lead us through in the coming 45 to 50 minutes, and you might go to the next slide. If you can. Thanks a million. So I hope we're going to look a little bit about where we are now, the current context surrounding education for transformation. I want to say something about the tricky, the non-linear, the complex relationship between education and social transformation. And I want to look at well springs of hope and inspiration, looking back, looking around, and looking forward before looking to the future with hope. And I must start by thanking you all, those who did get a chance to and are getting a chance to join us actively in the chat. Of course, I always remember the admonition of Paulo Freire, the great Brazilian educator, who, while thoroughly committed to engagement and participation in education, also reminded us that silence and reflection and quietly listening without feeling the need to write or say or do anything is also an important part of empowerment in education. So thanks to those who have added to the chat and to those who prefer to remain silent. So I want to look around us, and you know, you can't talk about education that's about transforming the world without having some idea about how we are in the world. And if you want to go to the next slide, and if we look around and ask ourselves, where do we stand? Then it's very clear that the current context for understanding education for transformation, well, it's challenging. I sit in a little office in Ireland. I'm based, and most of my work is based in Europe. And I look out at the world and I see war and food security. It's very clear there's growing inequality, continued oppression. We face and have to name current genocide. We also are surrounded by culture wars, which include the demonization of minorities. It's hard for someone who has grown up in the 60s and 70s and 80s to watch while those who are possibly the smallest among us and the most vulnerable are demonized in pursuit of broader political agendas. We also see, and we have to be clear about the erosion of multilateralism, about the undermining of human and of people's rights. We see the normalization of propaganda and the assault on the truth. And while truths differ and truth is complex, nevertheless, the notion of truth has to be at the heart of what we're concerned about as educators. And we do see an assault on truth. We see an erosion of trust, including an erosion of trust in national institutions, in democracy, and in international institutions, although I will come back to that. This is to say nothing of the climate crises that surround us. Anyone who gardens or farms, or anyone who moves from one place to another, sees the challenges that we face in terms of biodiversity collapse. We are facing a world that, in the words of Sharon Stein, is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. And while I don't quite know how to pronounce the acronym VUCA, you know what I mean. We see all around us polycrises. And if we are to transform the world through education and transform education in order to change the world, then we have to be clear and open-eyed about the challenges that we face. I had the privilege of studying with a marvelous Irish educator when I was in teacher training, called Marceline O'Sullivan. And she used to say that the only source of true change is reality as it is, not reality as we want it to be. So we need to be open-eyed to the reality of the world the way it is and the challenges that face us. The next slide, please. So it's not a pretty picture, and we could be forgiven for questioning whether or not we are a bit mad to be talking about the transformation of the world and the transformation of education. Next slide, please. How can we begin to imagine that education can respond to these huge challenges, yet alone that education might transform things in favor of human and planetary flourishing? As we might say on the north side of Dublin, are we out of our bleeding minds? Well, I'd suggest that we probably need to be a little bit out of our minds to engage in education for transformation. And we need to question the ways in which we have understood the world as we move towards changing it. But we do have huge resources at our beck and call in regard to changing the world. And next slide, please. And part of our resources lie in the nature of narrative, because as long as human beings have told stories, at the heart of lasting stories are the relationship between justice and injustice, between the relationship between the way the world is and how it might be. Essentially, the relationship between ideology, the stories we tell ourselves to keep the world the way it is, and utopia, the stories that we tell ourselves in order to imagine that the way the world is now is not the way it has to be. Stories, utopian stories, that tell us that there might actually be the hope of a different future. And these stories have always been accompanied by implicit pedagogies, by assumptions about how people teach each other and learn from one another about how the world is, about what's wrong with the world, and about how to set it right. So for every order that came from on high that said, you shall do as you are told, there are stories and songs, there's graffiti, and there are murals that shout out against that and say, let my people go. And these stories have always been accompanied by operative ontologies, understandings of what it is to be human and to become more human, and operative sociologies, understandings of what it means to be together in society. These stories carry with them tangible care for the earth. And, I have to admit that sometimes when I see speaking of stories in marketing or advertising or management, I ask myself where they get their understandings of stories. And I think that, there's a lot of interest in story and narrative, some of it good and healthy and fruitful, but some of it is just surface. And I think we have to go back to the rough ground of philosophical tradition and reflection in order to understand the origin of narrative and how important stories are in saving us from the worst of ourselves and imagining what might be best in our future flourishing. And I rely on Paul Ricoeur and the French philosopher and his work, which focuses on the nature of narrative and how action, story, action is the structure of how we are as human beings and perhaps our hope for the future. Ricoeur talks about how narrative and story transmutes chronological time, the ticking of the clock, into human time, into what we choose to remember and to record and to recall, and to evoke. And also, equally importantly, what we choose to consign to the dustbin of memory and not to remember and to leave aside. Stories of injustice carry with them the seeds of resistance and of learning how to imagine a world of justice. And so I'm going to try and lead us, though I usually do this in a physical space rather than in a virtual space. So we're going to try this and see whether it works or not. But I want to lead you back to a story of your own. And so if we could go to the next slide, please. I hope that whatever classroom you'd like to call to mind, it didn't look like this, but I would like to bring you back to remember a school classroom that you once frequented, either recently or not so recently, or in my case, a long, long time ago. And I want you to imagine yourself back there on a wet Wednesday in November. And I want you to remember what you see. And I'd like you to recall what and who you hear. And I'd like you to remember, if you can, what it smells like. And if you prefer not to remember a classroom, you can also remember a different learning space, a space in a scout den, or in a youth club, or in a community action group. Have you got that recollection? Now, I'd like you to take it with you to the next slide, please. Because if I'm not mistaken, whoever was running that school or youth club or that had some idea about what school is for, about what education is supposed to be about. They had, for want of a better phrase, an operative philosophy of education that said something about what school purpose is, about what learning is supposed to be for. And while I'm going to oversimplify now for a few minutes, I'd suggest that that understanding could be framed in terms of a number of models of education, models of the purpose of education. And I'm going to limit it to 4 here. And let's call model 1, passing on traditions of learning and academic excellence. Let's call model 2, education as being for personal development and human fulfillment. If the school you were at or remembering was led by those who believed in model 3, then it was about social integration, about enabling people to become good citizens. Of course, there's a narrower version of that, which is about enabling people to become employable and skilled workers. And finally, there's a 4th model, which is about social transformation, about changing the world towards greater justice, sustainability, human rights, equity, diversity, acceptance. Now, obviously, these 4 models that I suggest and propose, they're kind of ideal types. There is no particular school that exists simply in one of these frames or models, but schools, other learning institutions, they usually reside somewhere in between. So if you're looking at that PowerPoint on your screen, you might try to situate that school that I asked you to remember, where it might be in the slide. Or if you wanted to think of the room that you're in as having 4 corners, with each of the models being in one corner, You might then ask yourself where you would stand in the room if it was to represent where that school resided in terms of the continua of different models of education. And, so I see one response from Arian who says that the school that he went to was in the center. And I wonder if we were to take a poll, although I won't try to at the moment, where most would reside. And don't get me wrong. If you are looking for a brain surgeon or a poet, then education that has passed on traditions of learning and academic excellence is very necessary. We shouldn't have education that doesn't take account of personal development and human fulfillment. And yes, we need social integration in education if we're to have a society at all. So I'm not suggesting that. I'm seeing some people who are saying at the center, and I find that very interesting because having done this activity many times before, I find that for many in school, it is somewhere between Model 1 and Model 2. And that increasingly, Model 3 comes into the fore. And I'm seeing that some are between 2 and 3, some are remembering the feeling of being incredibly hot. And I'm also seeing that some are saying that actually there was always freedom within the school to move in different directions. But if you want to go to the next slide, if we go back to where we stand in the world and what the world is facing and what we see when we look around us, we have to ask ourselves, what's the education does the world need? And while again, I say that we're not abandoning Model 1, 2, or 3, I do think, and if you want the next slide, please, I do think that where we need to go increasingly is towards Model 4, towards social transformation, towards changing the world, towards greater justice, towards greater human rights, towards greater sustainability, towards greater acceptance of diversity. And I do see that someone says that the high level of vision in my school was Model 4, and others that are saying 2, 3, and 4. So I'm hoping that things are moving in this direction. And I'll come back to that thought in a moment. But I want to nuance what I'm saying now a little bit, if that's okay. Because, and you might move on to the next slide with just the first part of it. So there's a tricky and complex relationship between education and social change. And there's a danger attached to oversimplifying that relationship, because education should first and foremost be at the service of those who are learning. And once education starts to work from an extraneous program or external agenda, it ceases to be education and freedom and starts to head towards indoctrination. How do we ensure that that doesn't happen? Well, the primary subject of education must always be the human subject, the learner, in all their freedom. And putting the primacy of the learner and of groups of learners at the heart of teaching and learning including in the details of curriculum choice and in educational governance and leadership. It's not simple, but it's necessary because it's our guarantee of freedom within education. The alternative, the 20th century saw many examples of what, political projects that had education attached to them led to, from the gulags to the killing fields. And we need to be very clear that education should never be at the service of particular political programs. But that's not to say that education can be neutral. It's never neutral. It's either working in the service of the status quo and keeping things the way they are, or it's opening people's minds and hearts to the realities of the world and the need for change. But again, to restate it, education is not a messenger boy. It's not a harbinger of some greater good. On the contrary, what we need to reassert is the fact that education is the prior good. Education is the public good that is the necessary prerequisite for transforming the world towards greater justice and sustainability. So that's the caveat. And before having said that, and before we move on to the next slide, I just want to take a moment to pause and to ask you a question, if that's okay. And again, please feel free to answer in the chat, to have a moment yourself, or to share with anyone who happens to be in the room with you. And meanwhile, I'm going to share with my colleagues in Jean, who constantly support and work, and particularly Anna Larcher and Lydia Labachi. I'm going to share with them the same question, and also a different one. And I am I'm going to give you 2 or 3 minutes for that, if that's okay. And I see some very good friends and colleagues in the chat as well. Hi, Karina, how are you? Good to see you. Good, and thank you all for sharing with us signs of hope. And something that was said in the chat, which is that sometimes from a colleague from Canada. And I hope I don't misinterpret your rich contribution there, but this is something that the organization that I work with, Jean, this is something on which we base everything that we do, because we're established as a network of policymakers from ministries of education and ministries of foreign affairs. We're established on the basis that by learning together and sharing together, that there is solidarity in solutions, and that even if we work in splendid isolation at national level, together we can learn from each other and make a more impactful, actually no, a more fruitful difference. So thank you. And thank you all for sharing a bunch of young and fresh faces every morning makes me, I've lost it, push back cynicism and hope a little every day. Indeed. So thank you for sharing that hope, and thank you all for sharing in the chat, and also for giving me a break and talking, because I find it difficult to talk for long periods of time without a break. So thank you also for that. I want to move on to some signs of hope that we see, and to gather some aspirations as well. So if you could move to the next slide. So what I'm saying is that there is hope on the horizon, but we're going to look back a little bit before we look forward. And to give you a picture of where we are in terms of traditions of education for transformation and varieties of naming those traditions in European countries. I'm conscious that many of our participants are not from Europe, so I want to ask you again a question. What do you call education for transformation in your country or in your context? And again, feel free to use the chat or not, as you see best. And if you want to go to the next slide, please. In European countries over the last 30, 40, 50, and in the case of Norway, almost 70 years, there have been traditions of education for social change, local and global. And these are some of the namings that have happened over those decades. I myself come from traditions of development education and anti-racist education. In other countries, education for gender equality is strong. Global citizenship and international solidarity is what they call what we do in France. In many countries in Europe and globally, education for sustainable development is the preferred term. And these different types of education for social change, local and global, have developed different traditions and different histories in different European countries and in different countries globally, and mean different things for different people. One of the advantages of this is, the diversity. And I think it was Wendell Berry, the North American environmentalist, who talked about how lack of diversity is the precursor to extinction. So this diversity is not a bad thing, it's a good thing. And yet, because these traditions have grown up, sometimes in splendid isolation, sometimes in competition for resources, we've try to begin to gather forces and to bring things together. And so for the last few decades, we've used the term global education. The next slide, please. And if you'd like to learn more about national histories of global education, we have a series of books. Volume 1 came out this year, which charts the history of global education, very different in different European countries, and that gives some sense of where things are. If, on the other hand, you prefer to look at national situations as they are at the moment, the Gene Knowledge Bank can give you some access to that, but we're limited to European countries. Not the most important countries in the world, we'd have to acknowledge, but nevertheless where we are situated. And so based on the differing types of education for social change, local and global, that have emerged in European countries, and the next slide, please. Over the last few decades, we've been gathering these into an umbrella term. We use the term global education to gather those differing types of education for social change. What do we mean by global education? I'm going to refer now to the definition of global education that was developed in the process towards the European Declaration on Global Education to 2050, the Dublin Declaration that Ariane mentioned and was kindly, along with colleagues from other continents involved in our Global Critical Friends group. And if you'd like to go to the next slide, please. So this is global education according to the Dublin Declaration. It's not neutral. It's about reflecting critically on the world. It's about empowerment, understanding, imagination, hope, and action. And it's clearly aligned to human rights, to diversity, to inclusion, and to a decent life for all now and into the future. It is about human flourishing. And it's not only about the power of education to transform, it's also about the transformation of education. And for more on that, and with thanks to my colleague Anna Larcher, who is largely responsible for much of the content of this PowerPoint, you'll see in the chat a link to the declaration. Now, this declaration, and the next slide, please, was a combined work starting with ministries and agencies across Europe. Put in the next slide, please. But also involving not only policymakers, but also youth organizations, civil society organizations, local and regional government, international organizations like UNESCO and the OECD, researchers, and our global critical friends, some of whom are here today. And through a process of 1.5 years long, we developed this declaration. If you're interested in more about it, the next slide, please. We have it in a variety of languages. We have it in summary version and also in a more popular and colorful version that some have found useful in terms of developing teacher education materials, etc. And the declaration it's not a formula, it's not an action plan, it's simply a way of developing national strategies, a framework for developing national strategies to increase and improve global education. We've been working at European level and at national level in European countries to realize the promise of the declaration. Next slide, please. And we do this country by country and stakeholder by stakeholder. Last week, we had the privilege of being in Latvia as Latvia celebrated 20 years of membership of the EU. And we were delighted that our Latvian colleagues from the Ministry of Education decided to focus on, as part of their remembrance of what means to be European, to focus on the links between local and global justice and education. And don't get me wrong, for those of us in this group who are not from Europe, I'm very conscious of the fact that being European, given our history, also comes with histories of colonization and plunder and pillage and the destruction of the earth and the eradication and genocide of indigenous peoples. We can't talk about European values without recognizing and acknowledging where these have come from. Nevertheless, we also have to reimagine and reconstruct European values for the 21st century. We're delighted that our colleagues from Latvia, one of the smaller countries in Europe, has decided that their understanding of their heritage and political engagement with the EU is also about human rights, about democracy, and about education for justice, local and global. And they are not alone. Next slide, please. If you could. Because in other countries, there are strategies that are being used to ensure that global education is increasingly part and parcel of education systems, formal and non-formal. And if you'd like to go on to the next slide, please. And one particular example of this is our colleagues from Belgium earlier on this year launched their national strategic note on global citizenship education, which we think is a wonderful example of how a national strategy can reflect the values of the Dublin Declaration while being very specific about the national and indeed the federal and local and regional educational structures that exist. And so I return to the declaration definition, and I would and to the next slide, please. And I would simply suggest that while again we are very clear that this is a definition and a process that was developed in Europe for Europeans, we are also inspired by the work that our colleagues have done, including Karina's work in the Asia Pacific region, including work with colleagues in Latin America, and including the work of some of our colleagues in Africa. So we'd like to thank them for their inspiration. Okay, moving swiftly along and to the next, we have some evidence of hope and some evidence of strategies that might get us where we need to go in terms of education for transformation. But I wouldn't be a global educator if I couldn't engage in a little bit of self-criticism. And so global education in Europe, well, next slide, please. And what might we need? And I think that there are certain things that we need to continue on a path to in order to discover. If you'd like to hit the next, please. I think we need more grounded theory, because global education has come from activist bases, whether it be human rights education, development, intercultural education, education for sustainable development, environmental education. We've come from activist spaces. We need more grounded theories. I mentioned our interest in developing histories, and while we can develop academic histories of the recent past, we need to ground ourselves in more foundational histories of the passing on of traditions and transformation. We also need policy that is research informed. And so the Angel Network is a great source there. And finally, I believe that we need more imagination. We need to be clearer that education for social change and transformation needs to rely on imagination, and on a utopic imagination that says no to the current reality as it is, including the ways in which we have structured society so that it is unequal. Now, there are other signs of hope, and I want to share with you just some resources as we enter the final few minutes of this presentation. I want to share with you some resources that I hope will be useful in your own work, and that I'd encourage you to explore as we forge together a changed and a more just world. And one surprising source of hope for us in Gene, and I'd ask you to move to the next slide, please, and with thanks for, and to the next. I hope that this is a little bit surprising, but we've been working in Gene for many years with our colleagues from the OECD, not so much in the education side, we do a little bit of that, but in the development cooperation and development data side of the OECD. And we were delighted when they invited us to contribute to the Development Cooperation Report 2024. Why? Because in the words of Paulo Freire, what makes educators think that people aren't always already educated and knowledgeable? I used an Irish phrase there, in the know. But looking at public opinion research globally, well, when we look around or hear the news, you might be forgiven for thinking that in terms of what the public thinks and knows, that we're heading to hell in a handbag and that there really is very little hope for public support, public engagement, public knowledge of the issues that we care about. But it's not the truth. It's not the case. Actually, what we see when we look at the surveys and we delve deeply into public opinion research, we see that there's consistently high public support for combating poverty globally, for tackling inequality at home and abroad. And strangely, that support in European countries is higher now than it was 10 years ago. Hard to believe, but true. There are also remarkably high levels of interest and support for climate action, not only in Europe, but globally. Remarkably high levels of trust in international organizations in regard to combating poverty and fighting inequality. So, and the greatest thing of all is that the support is highest among the young. So we see this as very hopeful, and I refer, you can find out more about that on the Gene website or the OECD website. And while it's not, I mean, I'm seeing comments in the yes, you're right, it's not all good news. I mean, and Europe, as elsewhere, does have to battle with the emergence and in some countries the surgence of the right, the resurgence of the right. Nevertheless, if you look at general public opinion polling, it does give us hope for the future. There are other signs of inspiration and hope we mentioned already, and you might move on to the next slide, please. We mentioned already the Dublin Declaration and other regional initiatives, including the regional roadmap of Asia Pacific, global initiatives like the UNESCO 2023 recommendation. And we're also really impressed by the work of the Ibero-American Network on Global Citizenship for Sustainable Development. So we see signs of hope in terms of multilateral agreements, regional agreements, and also policy learning between regions. You might move on to the next slide. We see plenty of hope in the forward-looking work of UNESCO, and more of that can be found on the Futures Education website. And I'm coming to a close now, but we see little stories and signs of hope. If you could move to the next slide, please. In some of the initiatives that cross borders, in initiatives that bring academics and activists together, like the work of Synergias. I mentioned the work of Angel, which bridges the gap between policymakers and academics. There's also the work of Platforma in Europe, which gathers local and regional authorities, including those involved in global education. There's marvelous work that goes on in national youth councils and in development cooperation and foreign policy units within ministries of foreign affairs. We see inspiration in the work of some smaller countries in Europe, but also in larger countries in Europe, and you can see more of that I've already mentioned Belgium. And finally, just to conclude, we also see great hope in the sort of gatherings, and you might move to the last slide, please. In the sort of gatherings that you have organized, the Global Citizenship Foundation has organized today, as we look at in the different strands of this conference, we see the creativity in weaving those strands of hope together. And so we're looking forward to hearing more from the further conversations that you'll have today, tomorrow, and the day after. It reminds me of one of my favorite Irish poets, Patrick Kavanagh, who talks about how to be really alive is to keep on believing in the masterpieces we will create tomorrow. And so we're looking forward to hearing about the marvelous work that you will continue to do in transforming education and in education for transformation. And finally, last slide. Thank you. There are some contacts that my colleague Anna might share or Lydia might share in the chat. And thank you all for your engagement. And thanks to the Global Citizen Foundation for the kind invitation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liam. Am I audible? Liam?
Yes, I can hear you, Aryan.
Perfect. All right. So thank you so much, Liam, on behalf of everyone at the International Conference on Transforming Education 2024, including the steering committee, our attendees. I extend our deepest gratitude to you for your profoundly inspiring keynote address, very frank in its approach. So you've given us a lot to think about. Your words today reflect a lifetime of dedication to education that not only teaches, but education that transforms. So thank you so much. We are very energized and inspired by your vision, your work, and your uplifting message of hope. So your insights today have not only enriched this gathering, but have also set a very meaningful tone for the journey that we embark over the next 3 days and beyond the conference. So thank you for your time, your energy, your passion, and unwavering dedication to advancing global education for all, global education for social justice. So we look forward to witnessing and being inspired by the continued impact of your work in years ahead. So please join me, everyone, in extending a heartfelt appreciation to Liam. Thank you, Liam. Now, before you leave, Liam, we have a cultural performance that we wanted to showcase to you. So there you go. So we'll be playing a performance by ITL School in Delhi, India. So here we go.
अयं निजः परोवेति गणना लघु चेतसा उदारचरिताणां तु वसु कुटुम्बकम्
One for all and all for one. I am yours and you are mine. Together we stand for all. One world, one goal, equity and education for all. One world, one hope to see how much better world. Hope, love and peace. Unity in diversity is what we see. I am Nijaham, Paroveti Gadana Laghu, Chetasa Udara Charitana. Tu Vasudeva Kutumbakam. The thought that we aren't related is long and gone and updated. I am yours and you are mine. Together we let humanity shine. Global Citizenship Foundation has formed a better world. It is for everyone, for us a whole world of family. I am Nijaham, Paroveti Gadana Lahu, Chetasam Udara Charitanam. Tu Vasudeva Kutumbakam. United Nations, United Laws. We are global citizens. We're gonna keep ourselves peaceful and a brighter future. Global Citizenship Foundation has formed a better world. It is for everyone. We are the shapers of a better and united nation. I am Nijaham, Paroveti Gadana Lahu, Chetasam Udara Charitanam. Tu Vasudeva Kutumbakam. I am Nijaham, Paroveti Gadana Lahu, Chetasam Udara Charitanam. Tu Vasudeva Kutumbakam. I am Nijaham, Paroveti Gadana Lahu, Chetasam Udara Charitanam. Tu Vasudeva Kutumbakam.
Thank you once again, Liam. I hope you have a great year ahead.